Clerk will communicate the action of the Senate to the House. Unfinished business.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 10, urging Congress call convention to amend Constitution of United States.
Questions on adoption of the resolution? Is there discussion? Senator Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senate Concurrent Resolution 10, reported from the Senate Judiciary Committee, is a call for Congress to call a convention of states for the purposes of proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States as expressed in the resolution. Article 5 of the United States Constitution provides the procedure by which the Constitution may be amended. And it says, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. That's occurred 27 times in the history of our nation. Many more amendments than that have been proposed, but amendments have been ratified 27 times. Or, Article 5 says, or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. So, under the Article 5 process, what has to happen is 2/3 of the state have to make the request for Congress to call a convention. That number is 34. 34 is the number that gets you to the 2/3 threshold. And then once a convention occurs, any amendments to the Constitution proposed by such a convention would have to go through the ratification process, which is 3/4 of the states. So 3/4 of the states, or that number is 38, would have to ratify an amendment. Members will recall we sent such a resolution last year from the House to the Senate dealing with balanced federal budget. And I don't know if the House acted upon it at all, but they did not pass it. So I don't know whether it got scheduled up for debate or discussion in committee or on the floor of the House, but they did not pass the concurrent resolution we sent to them last year. This one is a little broader than that, and it calls for a convention, calls for Congress to call for a convention to propose amendments relating to fiscal restraints on the federal government. So in that regard, it's similar to the one that was passed by the Senate last year. To limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. So this resolution would call for a convention for that purpose. I'm told that there are so far 5 other states which have passed such a resolution. So if we were to do it, West Virginia would be, I believe, the 6th of the 34 required. Tennessee is apparently the last state that did that, and did it just earlier this month. So, Mr. President, I'd be happy to answer questions. Otherwise, urge adoption of the resolution.
Is there further discussion? Senator from Logan.
Mr. President, I respectfully rise in opposition to SCR 10. We had a tremendous debate in Judiciary the other day, and I just wanted to reaffirm to this body some of the comments that I made, because they're from the heart. It's the way I feel. I made the comment that America is the best and is the model for the world. The world. Everybody in the entire world in some facet wants to be in America. They want to be here so bad that we're talking about building walls to keep them out. So evidently they're wanting to be here. So how bad are we? We have economic times and struggles, there's no doubt. But the Constitution was given, and I said the other day too, challenging our Constitution of the United States and trying to tell Congress that you need to do it this way or that way is almost like trying to dissect the Holy Bible. It was created by the best. Now, do I agree that we got problems? Absolutely. But the people sitting up here and over here had the ability to send people to Congress to make the rules and regulations, and they are defined by election every 2 years. We've had administrative changes, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. We still have problems. But look at the rest of the world. Everybody sitting in the balcony up here is in the top 5% of the most richest people in the world. So how bad can we be? In other countries, you walk out and you send your kids down the road, you're not sure that they're going to come back home for dinner. But the basic point of this SCR 10 that I have a problem with, should the counties, and again I was told by one of my colleagues, and he was accurate, that we'd have to change the state constitution. But should the counties be allowed to come up and challenge us? Right now they are. We got PEIA problems. They're challenging us on how to backfill the budget. We continue to be in a deficit as far as incoming and outgoing revenue for the last 3 or 4 years. But should all the presidents of the county commissions or municipalities be able to have a meeting and come up here and dictate to us how we do our business? If you do it on top, why wouldn't you do it on the bottom? So, if we was going to put a resolution like we did a couple years ago, and we challenged the EPA, asking them to put West Virginia in the Atlanta region, not the Philadelphia region, I signed on to it. We're in the wrong region. There is things you can fix to make this country better, this area better. But to challenge the Constitution of the United States and trying to rearrange the functionality of it without expressing 1 or 2 particular reasons and leaving it wide open, I think is totally dangerous. So with that, I urge rejection of SCR 10.
Is there further discussion? The Senator from Montague.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, I rise simply because I want my name on record as opposing this piece of legislation. And as I did in committee, I will share with you why I oppose this piece of legislation by directing your attention to page 2, line 17 of this resolution, which says, "Further resolved, the state of West Virginia hereby applies to Congress under the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States for the calling of a convention of states limited to proposing amendments to the constitutions that impose fiscal restraints, proposes and limits on the federal government, limits the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the term limits of office for with officials and members of Congress, and absolutely no other business will be authorized." Well, that's not true, because the language where it says limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government is wide open. And as I said in committee, I'm not an English major, but I did go to school and I did go to college. And I do know that that language, written as it is, leaves things wide open for interpretation of those members who are selected to participate in this Article 5 convention. Now, as students, we learned that in our political science classes that the Constitution is sometimes referred to as a living and breathing document. Well, that may be true to some degree, but I believe it's more an elastic type of document where it adjusts itself periodically with the changes within our country as time goes on through the course of our history. So again, folks, I would strongly urge you to think about what you're doing here today. Yes, right now it's only 5, but it could very well pick up steam and be 10 by 2 years from now. The bill also doesn't limit how long we leave this out there. So we could all also be long gone and dead and not happy with what's going on, and they call a constitutional convention and begin changing things from there on. We don't want to be our own enemy, and that's what this piece of legislation potentially does. And I would strongly urge you to oppose this resolution.
Further discussion. Senator from Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also rise in opposition to the resolution for a couple of reasons. One is, as indicated by the Senator from Morgan, this one is even broader and more open-ended than the one that we considered and debated last year on this floor. You know, there are 2 ways to amend our Constitution. The first method is the one that our country has always used, where Congress proposes amendments to the states for ratification. That method has been tried and true numerous times. All the amendments to the Constitution were adopted in that fashion. This method has never been tried, and for good reason, because we don't know where it will go, because there are no constraints. And as we watch what happens in this body, and as we watch what happens particularly over in Washington, D.C., I'm just not convinced that there's any Thomas Jeffersons or Alexander Hamiltons or Benjamin Franklins over in D.C. that I would trust to open up our Constitution and perhaps rip it in two under the way this is written so broadly, as indicated by the Senator from Monongalia. They can call the convention, propose amendments, put physical restraints on government, limit the power or jurisdiction of the government, and say they can't do anything, and effectively neuter it. There's reasons that's never been done before in the 200-plus years our country's been in existence, and that's because it is a dangerous precedent. And I don't profess to be a constitutional scholar, but scholars from both ends of the aisle have been against it. I put on your desk yesterday, we just recently laid to rest Justice Scalia on Saturday, who was considered a very conservative, strict constructionist of the Constitution. And I highlighted on page 2 of the article addressing why Article 5 conventions are wrong ideas for the wrong time. And it said, quoted, when they were talking about whether or not a constitutional convention was a good idea, I highlighted, hence Justice Anton Scalia's brusque dismissal. I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. Whoa! Who knows what would come of it? Similarly, Justice Berger has come out as well against such a convention. As early as June 22nd, 1988, where he wrote a letter to Phyllis Schlafly, again indicated, I have also repeatedly given my opinion that there's no effective way to limit or muzzle the actions of a constitutional convention. The convention could make its own rules and set its own agenda. Congress may try to limit the convention to one amendment or one issue, but there is no way to assure that the convention would obey. After a convention is convened, it will be too late to stop the convention if we don't like the agenda. Again, we should, he indicated, by celebrating the Constitution in its long life, not by challenging its very existence. Whatever may need repair in our Constitution can be dealt with by specific amendments. That's the route to take. You want a balanced budget amendment, propose one, Congress, and put it to the vote of the people. Don't just say, bring us all together, let us do whatever we want, tear it up if necessary, and who knows, it could destroy the rule of law that has served us well for over 200 years. For that reason, Mr. President, I urge the rejection of the amendment, of the resolution, excuse me.
Further discussion. Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. President, sorry. I really hadn't planned on speaking today because I feel like we've debated this last session and Judiciary this session quite extensively, but a few comments were made this morning by some of my colleagues here that made me have additional thoughts. And my good friend and colleague, Senator from Logan, mentioned counties being able to challenge decisions made by the state, and why shouldn't they be able to do that? And I think that answer is rather simple. There's nothing in the Constitution that permits for counties to do so. And he further elaborated on comparing it to challenging the Bible. But I think to do so would be ignoring the Founding Fathers' decision to insert language in the Constitution that allowed for this very circumstance. My good friend, the Senator from Marshall, referenced Justice Scalia. And my colleague, Junior Senator from the 2nd, put on my desk this morning here something from Justice Scalia that I'm going to read for you. This is taking a quote, a portion of this statement here. And Justice Scalia said, "So it really comes down to whether we think a constitutional convention is necessary. I think it is necessary for some purposes, and I'm willing to accept what seems to be a minimal risk of intemperate action. The founders inserted this alternative method of obtaining constitutional amendments because they knew that Congress would be unwilling to give attention to many issues that people were concerned with, particularly those involving restrictions on the federal government's own power. And I think that's the key point here today. The Founding Fathers, in their wisdom and brilliance, inserted this language so that the states would have an alternative method for proposing amendments because they knew that Congress would be unwilling or unable to limit their own power, particularly when it comes to federal spending, which we've seen time after time. Congressional representatives on both sides of the aisle run for office saying we need to rein in federal spending. But have you seen any of that occur to date? I haven't. And I think this is just sort of the situation that language was inserted for. And as we've been debating this bill this morning, I have a debt clock here on my computer. Just while we've been debating this resolution, the federal budget has risen by $25 million just in the last few minutes. To me, that's a pretty serious situation. It continues to climb even as I'm speaking. And it was mentioned this morning that there's no way to assure that this convention can be limited, but I think to say that would be to ignore the very high bar that the Founding Fathers put in place to make sure that these debates do not get out of hand, and that high bar is the 3/4 of the states to ratify such an amendment. And for those reasons, I support this resolution.
Senator from Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, there's 5 attorneys in this chamber, and you know, we grow up and we're immersed in the Constitution and everything it's done for this country. This is another bill that doesn't, or another resolution, but more time from this body, that does nothing for the state of West Virginia. But here we are debating another one of these measures. Let's talk about something we can agree on. We live in the greatest country on earth. Now, there's politicians and people who run for office that try to get elected based on fear and prejudice and being angry. They just want to be in office. And at times things do look bleak. Today we have the deficit, which the senator from Ohio so eloquently talked about. It's a problem. We have ISIS. We have the debate on global warming. But think about the past in this country. Think about what's happened to this country. A revolution against a monarch, slavery, the Civil War. Imagine living in those times. Women's right to vote, ending child labor, giving workers the right to collective bargain, the Vietnam War, civil rights, Social Security. Do you think some people in some of the states were upset? Do you think people objected and thought the country was coming to an end? Do you think they wanted to rein in the federal government during those times? Absolutely. Our country always moves like a pendulum, swings in one side's favor and the other. Hopefully it's swung in West Virginia to the side it's on for a short period of time, but time will have to tell. But you know what? The Constitution has seen us through it all. It's a roadmap. Do you know that we're the longest single standing national government in world history? Think about that. In world history. Because you're about to act in a frivolous matter on a matter of utmost importance. My senator from Logan called the Constitution the governmental Bible of our country. And you wouldn't want to amend the Bible. Our founding fathers made the Article 5 Constitutional Convention a difficult thing to achieve. You know why? Because they wanted it to be used in only the most extreme circumstances. When we were faced with tyranny, with a dictatorship, with a complete concentration of power in a very small group that was going to tell the rest of us what to do. That's not what's happening in this country. It's the atomic bomb in the Constitution. Why? Because it opens up everything in the Constitution. Forget about the call in this resolution. By convening an Article 5 Constitution, practically every constitutional scholar, including the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, And many of our founding fathers recognized that it would open up the entire Constitution if the convention so chose. That means everything. The First Amendment, our Second Amendment right to bear arms, the rights of the states. That is a nuclear bomb to our Constitution. It could change the very foundation on which this country was founded and has done so well. The very mandate, and I understand it's a long road to get a constitutional amendment passed. The Founding Fathers did that on purpose. The very mandate will polarize this country, making people choose sides on these issues. Our country must rely on the voters to keep those in office that are doing what they choose and to throw those out that they are not. I think a balanced budget amendment coming from Congress is a great move. Congress ought to do it. It's controlled by the opposing party to me. Let's see it proposed. Let's see it get through. Those that don't vote for it, get them out of office. Because if we pass this conventional resolution today, it'll be years getting through the lawsuits and the decisions on how to run it. We won't know who will be in charge of the country or what mood they'll be in, and it could be a right dear to us that will be changed. Do not vote for a plan. Do not vote for a plan to change what has made this the greatest country on earth. I urge you to vote against this resolution.
Is there
Thank you.
further discussion? Senator from Greenbrier.
I'd ask that the gentleman from Morgan would yield, please.
Will the senator from Morgan yield? Looks like it. Senator yields.
Senator, you had said that there were 5 states who have done this. One of them is Tennessee. Who are the other 4?
The first to adopt this resolution was Georgia, and that was 2014, followed by Alaska, 2014, followed by Florida, 2014, followed by Alabama last year, 2015, and followed now by Tennessee on February 4th of this year.
Were all of those resolutions like this resolution, do you know?
I believe so.
They were open-ended? All of them were open-ended on the time frame?
On time frame?
Yes.
I
This
believe
is an open-ended time frame.
it has an open-ended time frame in it, yes, sir, and I believe the others do as well.
And there is open on the call, not just a single purpose, but a call for...
Well, the purposes are, let me say this, the limitation of purposes is the same in all the resolutions.
Okay.
The
Thank you.
purposes for which the Convention of States would be called.
Okay, thank you. Mr. President, I have stood many times on this floor. My speeches aren't very eloquent. I speak from what I know. I'm a simple farmer, part-time pastor, run a small business in Greenbrier County. I'm a history major from the great institution in the Eastern Panhandle, Shepherd University. And history and the love of our history is important to me. As important to me as that history is the love of this republic. We've done a lot of things in this body, and I've disagreed with a lot of those things. I felt they were harmful to the people of West Virginia, and I've stood and you've had my opinion, and you've gotten through it. You've probably read your emails a few times during that, and probably thought of what was lunch and all those kind of things. I've shared my opinion, what I felt strongly about. But what I share with you today is what I think is a danger. Our resolution, our laws, our bills that we've passed sometimes hurt the people of this state, and I felt they've hurt people in this state very badly. But that's my opinion, that's my feeling. But this resolution will hurt our republic if it passes and if it is ratified. It's an open-ended resolution. I am shocked that we're willing to do an open-ended resolution. Who knows how long it'll take to finish getting the states to do this? Let me tell you, I saw an interesting poll today on TV as I was getting ready to come in. 58%, I think that's correct, maybe 54% of the snapshot generation, which I'm not part of. I don't even know what that is exactly. It has something to do with technology. 54% to 58% believe we would be better off as a socialist nation. Now let me tell you what's wrong with that. Those are the future. This resolution goes to that period of time. They may be the people that are going to that convention to make that decision for us as a people. And quite frankly, I don't think we are better off as a socialist nation. I think we are better off the way we are right now, with a Constitution that we dearly love, we have great reverence for, and great appreciation for what it does. The senator from Logan spoke wonderfully about the Constitution being like a Bible. I have a couple of apps on my phone. I do know how to download apps. There are some things I can't do. I can't get an app down on my phone. I have an app of the Bible, because that's important to me, and I have an app of the Constitution, because that's important to me. And both of those are very, very dear to me. They're the center of who I am. They're the core of what I'm about. And we are taking the chance, because there are groups that have funded this, there are groups that believe this is important, and I appreciate groups that think something important. But we are taking a chance on the future of a future generation in 5 years, 10 years from now, to change a Constitution that to us is something that's probably the dearest thing we have outside of our faith, outside of our family. The senator from Ohio made a wonderful point that when the framers of the Constitution framed this, in their brilliance, they put Article 5 in. And the key was brilliance. Let me tell you, when that generation formed this Constitution, they were brilliant men. They were people who thought maybe we were all going to be brilliant for generations, and I'm telling you, we're not as brilliant as they were then. You look at the statesmen we've heard from and the readings and writings we have read. Those were people who seemed to understand that it wasn't about their interest, but it was about the good of what could be. They formed a union, they formed a republic that, while it was not perfect, it was the most perfect the world has ever known and will ever know. If we attempt in this resolution, if we chance in this resolution one bit to destroy what could be and what is, we have done a discredit to ourselves, we've done a discredit to our great nation, but more important than that, we've done a discredit to those who were before us, those who fought in wars, those who gave their life in service, and we're doing a discredit to those who come after us. Our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. I believe there's only moments in history where there is such brilliance. If you follow the debates on both parties this time, in politics, there isn't a lot of brilliance out there, folks. There isn't a lot of enlightenment out there on either side. We can do better. We must do better. I urge you today not to adopt this resolution. I urge you to vote against this resolution. I'm proud to stand and say that I will vote against it, and I hope that you do the same on this day. We cannot, we must not take this dangerous route as a people. Thank you.
Further discussion. Junior Senator from the 2nd.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm a little confused. We have people praising the Founding Fathers in the document that they've written, yet they're telling us not to use a portion of the document that they've written. Over the last 20 years, our national debt has doubled twice. Twice! Under administrations of both parties. So what is the hope that they're going to rein that spending in? The gentleman from Greenbrier mentions 54% wanting to go socialist. Well, the document says 75% have to ratify it. I'm not worried about that 54%. The senator from Greenbrier stood up and said it's an insult to those that have fought wars. Sir, I've fought wars. I'm not offended by this resolution, and I'm not offended by this document. Mr. President, I urge adoption of this resolution.
Further discussion. Senator from Upshur.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've heard several times that the Constitution ought to be revered like the Bible, and I'll have to admit that while I have a great deal of respect for the guys who drafted and framed the Constitution, I don't quite put it in that class myself. And I would ask the senator from Logan if maybe perhaps later he can show me where in the Bible I can't really quote chapter and verse myself, that we would find such a provision in the Bible that God gave to us as a way to modify the Bible in a legitimate fashion. But He gave us a Bible that He said was His Word, and we should stick with that. And the Founding Fathers gave us a Constitution that said that if you ever find that this document is not doing what it needs to do, there are two ways to change this document. And one way has been used 27 times to change the document. So the document itself is not the document that was drafted in 1787. The document is the document that was drafted in 1787 and amended 27 times since that date. And I would point out that the senator from Marshall County, I believe, said that the alternative method of modifying the Constitution or proposing amendments to the Constitution has never been used, and I don't believe that's actually true. The reason why it's not true is because it assumes the only way that second alternative can work is to actually have the convention. And what it neglects to notice is the fact that roughly half of the amendments that we have in the Constitution, counting things like the 17th Amendment, counting things like all of the Bill of Rights, are a direct response to states applying for changes to the Constitution, and Congress, before the number was properly reached to call the convention, recognizing the desire of the states and putting forth the amendments that the states were asking for. And so whether we actually have a convention out of this or not does not mean this can't be effective. We may get to 30 states, and then Congress may well put out some amendments that satisfy the concerns that are addressed in this particular resolution. In fact, I would be surprised if they don't do that. But if they don't do that, then we have to go to convention. It's the only way we're going to straighten out this federal government. I would also point out that 27 changes to the Constitution is probably not really an accurate assessment of what we've had to our Constitution. We've had a lot of decisions, especially in the last 4 or 5 decades, that no person can really find the legitimate basis within the Constitution as to how that particular decision was arrived at. And the reason why we've had those changes is because we currently have a court where 4 of the members read the Constitution and try to view everything in society through the lens of what the document says, and we have 4 members who rarely read the Constitution and always put forth their personal preferences as to what they would like for the Constitution to have said, but which it does not say. And today, we are faced with a perfectly divided, evenly divided court. 4 members who are for the Constitution and 4 members who are for something that most of us would never understand, I think, because of the death of a Supreme Court justice. And I would like to point something out to you. In the last 3 decades that justice sat on the Supreme Court, there have been literally dozens of decisions that were decided on a 5-4 basis. 5-4 where he was in the majority. If this president appoints another Ginsburg to this court, if this president appoints another justice like that, every single one of those 5-4 decisions that this court has arrived at will be flipped on its head. That means the Constitution will be changed literally dozens of times, as it has already been by judicial fiat. We're talking about big issues. We're talking about issues related to religious freedom. We're talking about issues related to free speech. We're talking about issues related to property rights. All of these things are on the table, not based on whether or not 34 states call a convention, not based on whether or not 38 states agree to the convention, but based on whether or not one man can pick somebody who knows how to read. And it's unfortunate that we're in that situation where one man can flip the Constitution back and forth, or one woman can flip the Constitution back and forth. Today it means this, tomorrow it means that. But that's where we are because we have allowed this government to stray so far from that document. Somebody mentioned that a lot of politics today is based on fear, and I think that what we're hearing on the other side of the aisle today is exactly that. It's a lot of noise that's been raised in virtually every line of attack that could be raised, that we should somehow fear exercising something that is contained within our Constitution, that our Founding Fathers knew the day would come. They knew the day would come. The debate around Article 5 was centered on the very question raised by the senator from Ohio. They knew this day would come, just as Scalia, in the document that was on our desk today, pointed out, that Congress would not do what was necessary. The senator from Harrison County pointed out in the Judiciary Committee, hey, you guys control Congress. Why don't you just go and get those guys to put out a balanced budget resolution? Exactly. They won't do it. And when the Democrats controlled Congress, they won't do it either. And term limits. 75% of the population of the United States for decades in poll after poll has indicated a preference for term limits, and yet Congress will not take up the issue. They won't touch the EPA. They won't touch Obama's overreach when it comes to the immigration system that we have. And the Constitution very clearly says immigration is within the purview of Congress. It says nothing about being within the purview of the President, and yet this President is allowing millions of people to stream across our southern borders. We had a debate the other day related to gun bills where we had senators who thought we should insist that every U.S. citizen, every law-abiding citizen ought to have a background check. But we let these guys stream across the southern border, and we found terrorists in that stream. No background check, no border check, no serious attempt at doing one of the most fundamental things that this government is supposed to do, which is guard our borders. Our situation is dire. We have a $20 trillion almost deficit. We have over $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. If it were simply a question of what's in the budget and what's in the deficit and the debt, maybe the balanced budget amendment would be the proper way to go. And I do support that resolution. I hope it makes its way through this body as well. In the last 20 years, the federal government in the Federal Register averaged over 70,000 pages of new rules and regulations and laws in the Federal Register. Over 1.5 million pages in just the last 20 years. If you think about that, a ream of paper is 500 sheets of paper. A box of paper is 10 reams. That's 5,000 sheets in a box. It would take roughly 300 boxes of paper. It would fill that entire area where you are, Mr. President, all the way down through the clerk's pit here. And that just represents the last 20 years of what this federal government has imposed on the citizens of the United States. And we're going to pretend like that is the limited government that is part of the vision that was originally put into the Constitution of the United States of America. 1.5 million sheets of paper that you're responsible for knowing every word. You're responsible. There's no ignorance of the law. You can't claim that. You're responsible for obeying every single word of that 1.5 million pages. This should not be about fear. This should be about recognizing that what's going on out in our country is bordering on chaos. Do you have any idea what national bankruptcy would literally look like in a nation of 330 million people? What's going to happen when that stream of immigrants coming across our southern border decide that they do want to engage in a large-scale terrorist attack? What that's going to look like? We have a government that has totally abdicated its responsibilities while delving into areas where it has no business. This presents an opportunity for the state of West Virginia to be part of the solution in much the same way that the original 13 states came together. They had some issues that needed to be addressed. They came together. They addressed those issues responsibly. As Scalia noted in this piece of paper that is here, the idea that a convention is going to come out with the repeal of the Second Amendment, first, it's outside the scope of this call. This limits the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, not the citizens. But would such an amendment ever be ratified? Of course it wouldn't. You couldn't get an amendment through even such a convention, let alone out to the floor or out to the states to be ratified. You couldn't repeal Social Security this way. This body wouldn't support that. No other state would support that. Anything that comes out of such a convention is going to have to be middle of the road, directly targeted at problems that everybody agrees that the federal government suffers under. That's regulatory excess. That's a budget that's out of control. That's laws that are clearly not contained within the direction of the Constitution or the purview of the Constitution, the enumerated powers. I would say to the members that have raised so many fears over there that we need to set aside those fears and we need to do the right thing for the people of West Virginia and for the people of the United States. We're the only ones who can do this. Congress is not going to do it. I urge adoption of this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further discussion? Recognize the senator from Morgan to close.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am as enamored and in love with our Constitution as anyone. It is, I concede, the greatest charter for government that's ever been devised in the history of the world. But it is not, nor has it ever been, perfect. It was required that the citizens of this country amend the Constitution to abolish the institution of human slavery, the 13th Amendment. As we discussed recently on the floor of the Senate, the entire Bill of Rights, which we also love and revere, came about as amendments proposed to the United States Constitution. The Second Amendment, which we were discussing this week and last week, was not part of the original document, nor was the first, restraining Congress's ability or authority to act in ways that infringed upon the rights of the people to petition the government for redress of grievances, to operate a free press, as we'll discuss later this week, to exercise religion freely. It was not perfect when, during that hot summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, but the wisdom, and let me, if I may, just talk for a minute about who was there. Someone mentioned Thomas Jefferson. He was not there. The representatives from Virginia, Mr. President, were Mr. Blair, a gentleman by the name of James Madison, whom we regard as the father of the Constitution, and a gentleman we've all heard of by the name of George Washington, who presided over the proceedings in that hot summer of 1787. The delegate from New York was Alexander Hamilton. From Pennsylvania were Robert Morris, Gouverneur Morris, Benjamin Franklin. I'm not going to read everyone who was at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. But they knew enough to know that nothing is perfect. Nothing of this earth, anyway, is perfect. And they left within the document mechanisms for future generations to make corrections when necessary. And as has been mentioned by others, we've adopted a total of 27 amendments to that Constitution, amendments that were proposed by the Congress, including the last one, which was adopted in 1992, but proposed in 1789. The 27th Amendment to the United States Constitution was one of the original amendments proposed by the first Congress in New York in 1789 and not ratified by the requisite number of states until 1992. So these things do, on occasion, take a long time. And like the gentleman from Upshur, I would suggest that we need not fear ourselves, our states. This other mechanism to compel Congress to call together a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments exists in the document, in the Constitution, as the final recourse when Congress will not act to propose necessary amendments. The gentleman from Upshur pointed out, it may never go to a convention of the states. On other occasions in our history, when the states have done what we should now do, stood up and said, Congress, you have to act, and called for such a convention, ultimately, the Congress has capitulated. Popular election of senators was such an occurrence. Popular election of U.S. senators. I am sufficiently confident that the ratification process, which would require the assent of 38 states, provides an adequate check on anything odd such a convention might do or recommend if it were convened. Mr. President, the threat to our liberty at the moment, the greater threat to our liberty, is not a call for or by the people to act to revise our structure of government. The greater threat to our liberty is inaction. Inaction. As was mentioned, a national debt fast approaching $20 trillion. A code of federal regulations that would fill this room probably. The members of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 surely never imagined our modern regulatory state. But a limitation on the power of the federal government that I would love to see, and I'm willing to put my name upon and my vote behind this resolution for the purpose of pushing toward, is something that we do here in West Virginia. A limitation that I think is reasonable in the power of the federal government would be simply that no regulation of the federal government be effective upon the people unless and until the Congress approved it. Think about that. In our rulemaking process, we empower executive branch agencies to make proposed rules and regulations, but we don't give them carte blanche to impose them on the people. We require them to be reviewed and approved by the elected officials, the House, the Senate, and the governor, in the form of legislation. Because of the absence of that authority, oversight in Washington, we see things that are incredulous if you think about it. Members of Congress standing up and decrying the breadth of regulations imposed upon the people. But the Congress gave them the power. I would like to see a limitation on that. That no executive branch agency of the federal government has authority to bind the people to rules or regulations unless and until they're approved by Congress. If that were the case, we wouldn't have things that we have right now in this country. Regulatory agencies of the federal government imposing rules and regulations that have been expressly rejected by the Congress. I do not fear the exercise of the authority expressly given to the people to control the federal government. Mr. President, I could go on longer, but I'll spare everyone that. I urge adoption of the resolution.
Question for the Senate is adoption of the resolution. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. No. The ayes have it. The senator from Marshall demands a division of the body. Question for the Senate is the adoption of the resolution. All those in favor will please stand. Be seated. Those opposed will please stand. Please be seated. The vote being 18 in favor and 14 opposed, more than a majority having voted the affirmative, I declare the resolution adopted.